Lunch. Okay. Yeah, right. Thank you. Well, welcome back. As I mentioned earlier before we went to lunch, the follow-up to the participant panel and some of the spinal stimulation was our intention to invite Dr. Vivek Pinto from Food and Drug Administration. And so please welcome Vivek. And Vivek is going to talk about the process at FDA for how things get approved, right? And hopefully, again, be thinking about relationship. What is our relationship to what you're going to talk about? Thank you. Welcome.
All right. So to make sure I got the clicker working. Okay. So thank you, Matthew, for inviting me and as well as the organizers for holding this event. As Matthew said, my name is Vivek. I'm the acting director for the Division of Neuromodulation and Physical Medicine Devices at the FDA. I want to talk to you a little bit about regulatory considerations when bringing medical devices to the market, as well as studying medical devices. Give you a little introduction in regulatory pathways, and also give you some information on places where the SCI community can get involved in the regulatory process and help demonstrate the benefit of a lot of these devices. I have a pretty large slide deck. I really tried to cut it, but it ended up being about 40 slides, so I'm going to try to go through these really quickly, and really the intent to have all these slides too is so that you guys can have information afterwards to go through the websites, the guidance documents afterwards, and I'm also going to give those out as a PDF that Matthew can send around afterward. So our vision at CDRH is to help increase patient access to safe and effective medical devices first in the world. You may have heard about different classes of devices. We utilize a risk-based assessment system. Increasing risk means that there likely will be increasing levels of control needed. I don't want to cover this in great detail, but with different levels of control, you're going to also have different submission types.
How are you?
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Yes. How's it going?
Okay. So the link below gives you some information on what sponsor investigators would need if they wish to start to study devices in humans. And it's particularly for those devices that meet the definition of a significant risk device. I have guidance documents at the end so that you can see the criteria for it. We used to have just feasibility and pivotal trials before, and there's some tidbits on each one of the types there. Generally, feasibility trial is used to support the pivotal study, which then the pivotal study is used to actually demonstrate the safety and effectiveness of a device for a marketing application. But recently, I can say too recently, but over the last decade, we've been able to approve many EFS studies, early feasibility trials. And the intent is we wanted to provide sponsors a way of looking into first-in-human trials when studies are very early in the investigation. The devices may not be close to final, might need to tweak designs, try out different outputs, and you're looking for a small number of subjects to see what the different safety and effectiveness impacts are going to be. The next two slides are on types of pre-market submissions. You have the PMA, HDE, de novo, and 510K. Again, I don't want to go too deep into these, but if you have questions, I could certainly answer them. But they each have different criteria. When we review a medical device, we look at two things primarily first, and that's the intended use and the technology. If there's a new intended use compared to something that's already been on the market, or if there's a technology that presents different risks or questions of safety and effectiveness compared to predicate devices, then a company may need a PMA or de novo to create a new classification. If if a device has been on the market and it's more of like a Me Too device, we have another pathway called the 510K pathway, in which a company demonstrates substantial equivalence, not on their own of safety and effectiveness. Okay. So some of these submissions require clinical data, some of them don't. For example, there's powered wheelchairs here. Majority of them rely on consensus standards to demonstrate substantial equivalence. This is the ECFR. That's a link for a website for the Code of Federal Regulations. I highlighted two parts here. So parts 800 to 861 are really general cross-cutting regs. They talk about the submission types, but then also quality systems, surveillance, and labeling, general regs. But what I do want you to look at afterward is the device-specific regulation panels. So I listed a few here. The physical medicine and neurological device panels are the ones that I have jurisdiction over. And within those panels, there's different specific device regulations. And so this could be pretty useful when you want to see what device that you use or want to use, what was the level of control needed to get that device to the market. You can search down to the description of the regulations, and then sub that, you can look at specific devices, and I have some links to, for you to search. Look at the specific devices to see what their indications for use were, what was the pathway to market for them. So this one, cosmetically, the site could probably be a lot better, but it's been like this for a while. But this is a snapshot of different inputs for the 510K pathway or database. And on the right side, that's very useful information. That's all the other public databases that you can look at. I actually haven't reviewed all of these myself. Like I see a few there, like the guidance documents and some of the post-market things. I'll go into why I haven't in a little bit, but these are very useful. Anytime you want to see mod reports or what's publicly going on, there's a mod report database. If you want to see de novo clearances or grantings, PMAs, this is the best place to go publicly. This is kind of a snapshot. Everything goes by, besides regulations, is product codes. And so this is a snapshot of the PHL product code for exoskeletons. If you click on, or if you type in PHL, this will show you all the cleared exoskeletons that we have available in the US. And then if you click on the sublinks, you can look through the 510K summaries to see what data was needed to support that application. Okay, now, how did we get there? We have a lot of different submission types. I didn't mention different pre-submissions yet either, but when a submission comes in, it goes to an assistant director who then needs to find a lead reviewer on their team or some other team to be the manager of that file. And so depending on what the expertise is of that lead reviewer, they'll look at certain aspects of the file or consult out to get different expertise. Most of the time, we have all the expertise in-house, maybe not in the division, but in different offices. But there are times, depending on the submission, where we may need to have a panel. We may need to, get expertise from outside the agency. And throughout all of these, I just wanted to highlight that we, the user's voice, the patient's voice is needed everywhere. It may come from the clinician that's on the team that has worked with these patients for 20 years. I have someone on my team that has a disability and is using the devices that they're reviewing. There's input from managers. The key aspect is we look at it as a team approach, but there's a lot of places where you can give your voice and where you're represented. Here are some of the key elements for the submissions. The timeline isn't short. A lot of these things take time to acquire. Biocompatibility, sterility. It may take different device designs to get to a point where a device is sterile or can become sterile and is biocompatible. I think like for the community, you should really also focus on the clinical testing, kind of, Jen was talking about. We need to make sure that you're demonstrating the clinical benefit. There's a lot of other benefits, but we need to make sure that the basis for the approval decision is on well-established endpoints. And through this, early communication is kind of the key that we're trying to let sponsors know about. I mean, Matthew talks about relationships. There's many sponsors here I see that we've had years of relationships, and it's developed. The teams or the review staff knows them. It's worked out really well, I think, for both sides. We try to also interact to make sure we're doing our reviews as timely as possible. Okay. I'm not sure how familiar you are with guidance documents. This is a way where we can express our thoughts, our interpretations of the regulations. This one's a draft brain-computer interface guidance document that we published last year. Now there's draft guidances and final, so it doesn't mean that every draft guidance is going to become final, but in fairness, what we do is we publish some drafts so that we can get comments from the public, and there's like a comment period. And we incorporate those if changes need to be made, or at least, if we need to, we might get comments for a future guidance document if we can incorporate them in these ones. Now, these can be device-specific like this, or there's a lot of them that are cross-cutting. So if you want to know about a particular submission pathway, there's plenty of guidance documents, and I listed many of them here, ones that I thought you would be important for this particular audience: patient preferences, breakthrough, and definitely other benefit risk guidances. Okay, so the next few slides are kind of focused on not necessarily my expertise, but what's going on in the agency. We have different people in policy positions that have different initiatives. And the big focus, of course, is to get that voice of the patient, get patients engaged in the process. We want to understand the view so that we can incorporate it into regulatory decisions. Let's see. There's not one link. There's two different links. There's a device advice link and a patient engagement link. But I do encourage you to review those and review them. I guess every year or so they get updated as well on new initiatives. Collaborative communities is something I'm still trying to understand myself. But and I've been talking with the person who's kind of coordinating that. But the intent is to bring communities together to solve common goals. And I don't know if it's the right time for this community for something like that. We don't have to be involved in it, but we certainly can be at the table. It's not run by the FDA, but I do encourage you to look at that website to see if this is something that your organization wants to form, and if so, email that link so that you can get you to the person in charge of it. You can certainly email me as well, and we can put you in contact. But they'll be able to better direct you on it. But it is something you should look into. Patient-reported outcomes. So we're trying to figure out how we can incorporate these in the regulatory decision making. There's some patient-reported outcomes. These are subjective measures mostly. So there is certain bias that can be built into them, but we're trying to see if there's ways to get around those biases so that we can use them. If you do want to issue like maybe a survey for the group and are trying to figure out which questions would be useful for us for regulatory decision making, I encourage you to submit a Q submission, on behalf of the group, and we can give you feedback on that. Patient preference information. The intent is to incorporate what the preferences are. This goes into benefit risk. It's really you guys that are you're telling the physicians, the researchers, what you're feeling during studies, and what kind of risk tolerance you're willing to go through to achieve certain benefits. We also need to know of that. there's, I believe, like a patient preference group that's really focusing on this amongst many, all the different conditions that they see across the different Office of Health Technologies. Not just us, but I certainly want to make sure that's being done, that we incorporate benefit risk decisions in our decision making for devices. But it really comes from what you guys tell us. This one could be very useful. It's a medical device development tools program. It's not run in our office, but if you're thinking of a certain clinical endpoint, or I guess there could be really any type of tool, and you want it to be more cross-cutting, or maybe you're an academic institution, you want many companies to use this type of tool that you think could be useful, this program might be of use to you. It publishes the information or the tool as like it's context of use instead of indication for use. But please also go to this website, to get more information on that. Two things we do in our office: we've held patient engagement seminars. So different advocacy groups, or just small organizations have come, with users of devices to present their experiences with the devices, and also the challenges that they see. Whether it's dealing with the risks of getting the device put in place, or adoption, or a host of different things. But we get more of that patient perspective that way, and I guess for us it's like a much safer environment because it's just with our staff. We can do it remotely, or we can do it in the office. But we've been doing those for quite a bit, and I think it's always good. I'll talk a little later about this reorg, but we're as we get more staff, we want to make sure that they're also being trained on the patient perspective. The ELP program, experiential learning program, has also been very useful. That's where if there's clinical sites, manufacturing sites, academics that host us for showing us their processes and challenges and experiences. We've gone to places where they've been doing different kind of surgeries, and I know we've done a few in this space as well. But that's another place where you can educate us on what your experiences are to help us make better decisions. It runs periodically, so if you are interested in it and it says it's closed, it will reopen at some point within a few months. So definitely check, but you can always email me as well. Don't know how good we are with time, but I only have a few more slides. So just to give you a quick overview of the agency and the infrastructure, the FDA has different centers, and our center is the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. Within our center, we went through a massive reorganization, probably the biggest one since I've been there, just over the last year, but really just got implemented a month ago. And so where we sit is in the Office of Product Evaluation and Quality. It's OPEC. Within OPEC, there's not only 7 offices. These are just the device-specific offices, or offices of health technologies. There's other regulatory policy offices and clinical evidence offices. But where we sit is the Office of Neurological and Physical Medicine Devices. And this is a layout of our office right now. You might notice that I'm on a few places over there. I do have help. It's not that I'm doing all that myself, but this gives you an idea of the different devices that we review in each one of the teams. And so in Division A, it's neurosurgical, neurointerventional, neurodiagnostic devices. And Division B, we have 4 teams. 2 of them are neurostimulation for neurological and psychiatric indications. And the other 2 teams, where I was the branch chief of those 2 teams before we did this reorg and split, we have acute injury and neurodegenerative, but really they're assistive devices in one team and therapeutic devices in the other. Q submissions. There's different types. I really encourage anyone who does want to interact, especially sponsors, to go read this document and interact with us early. Many of you have, and have done it very far in advance. We have informational meetings that are really useful where there's no real pressure. It's just the sponsor or the group wants to present us information and let us know what they're thinking in their timeline, and we can give them some high-level feedback. But it gets to build these relationships quicker, and you know, it's definitely led to very positive outcomes. This kind of early interaction process. I forgot all my business cards at home, but this is my contact information if you need to email me. And Matthew, I'll give you the PDF for the slides so then you can give it to the group. I also have a lot of references over here for you to look at as well. The parallel review program, I think Susan may touch upon it. And some other, there's like a whole host of guidance documents that could be helpful as well. But I wanted to make sure I just put a lot of information here for you guys to be able to do, you know, like go back and look through things and have resources to help. Thanks.
Thanks, Vivek. Thank you. And remember, Vivek will come back for a conversation with Megan Moynahan and Susan Miller, who you're going to hear from right now a little differently. We have done this in the past a few times, so hopefully this will go without any difficulty. Susan is on the East Coast, could not come in person, but we really wanted to hear from her. So you're going to see her hopefully any second show up on the screen, that this will work. And she should be able to see the room from my iPad. Hopefully that's going to show up. This is Dr. Susan Miller from Centers for Medicare and Medicaid to talk about. Oh, there you are. Welcome, Dr. Miller.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you all hear me? There's an echo here.
Yeah. We will try to clean up that audio, so hang on just a second. You can have a good
Is
look
that
at.
better now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. All right. All right. Well, thank you very much for having me this afternoon. It's quite an honor to speak to all of you. My goal today is to sort of take off the veil of mystery from CMS and allow you to see some of our processes. And particularly, I want to speak about those that provide innovative technology to our beneficiaries and how we have structured that to bring these technologies to our patient population as early as we possibly can. You have to think of Medicare as a three-legged stool, and that is first coverage, then it's coding, and then it's payment. And each one of these is a separate entity. I'm going to concentrate on coverage first because, one, that's what I do. And two, if you don't have coverage, coding and payment may not be of interest to you. For the reference, you can Google the Innovator's Guide to Navigating Medicare. And you can just go through your browser for that. Version 3 from the year 2015 is the particular edition that you're looking for, and it will contain basically all of what I am going to say, and it will provide you websites by which to get further information. And I will extend to you the invitation that if you go through Megan or you go through Matthew, I am happy to provide any other information to you that you need and that I can give to you. So let's start from the beginning and talk about coverage. And I want to give you a 30,000-foot look at the principles of Medicare that govern coverage. So first of all, it's important to know that the administration of the Medicare program is basically governed by the Social Security Act. And basically that means that there are laws which we have to work within that give us the parameters for the Medicare program. So you need to know three things in general about Medicare coverage. First of all, in order for any item or service to be covered, it must have a benefit category. So what's a benefit category? A benefit category is like a physician service or a diagnostic test, or it's durable medical equipment, it's prosthetics, it's orthotics, it's supplies, that sort of thing. Now, sometimes these benefit categories are defined in regulation, but you have to be a little careful that they're defined in statutes. But you have to be a little careful because they are also defined in regulation. So when you go look for DME, durable medical equipment, in statute, it basically says that we'll cover iron lungs, well, that's been a while, and oxygen tents. And then it goes on and it says we cover wheelchairs and hospital beds. But when you start looking at the regulations, you see that there has to be an appropriate useful time for these devices. They have to be appropriate for use in the home. They have to be generally not useful for people who are not injured or ill. And so there are other caveats to DME that are just found in the law. So when you think about your particular technological device, you have to know that you have to fulfill all of these criteria in order to get a benefit category or whatever the criteria are for the benefit category that you are going for. Okay, so that's principle number one. Principle number two is that there are certain things that are specifically excluded from coverage by Medicare, and this is again by law. So many of you may not know that we're not allowed to cover hearing aids. We're allowed to cover glasses, but only in a very, very limited situation. So you must make sure that your technological or your device is potentially coverable by Medicare. And that brings us to the third important factoid of Medicare, and that is in order to obtain coverage, the item or service needs to be reasonable and necessary. So the key phrase here is what we call RNN. There is no list of standards. There is no hard and fast definition for what is reasonable and necessary. But what I can tell you is that we do frequently get asked if the FDA has approved or cleared a device, does that make it reasonable and necessary? And although typically a device must receive FDA approval or clearance for at least one indication in order to be Medicare or potentially eligible for Medicare coverage, just the FDA approval or clearance does not entitle the device to coverage, because the law has set up an authority for Medicare to assess separately from the FDA to determine if any item or service is appropriate for Medicare coverage. So why have two systems? Well, in addition to all of the other things that the FDA does, and we're not going into that very long list, the FDA looks for safety and effectiveness. In contrast, Medicare has traditionally looked for relevant health outcomes, and when we look at a new technology or a new device, we are looking at whether or not this intervention improves net health outcomes in the Medicare population, at least as well as established treatments already work. So it is likely that the FDA and the CMS will be looking at perhaps the same sources of information in order to make their own very different determinations, but we look at them with different lenses. So that then brings us back to how does the coverage process work? Well, it's hard to appreciate, but we don't have policies on most things. If you need an appendectomy, you get an appendectomy. There's no policy as to who can have their appendix taken out or not. If it's necessary, it happens, and Medicare will cover that and eventually pay for it. But for those items and services, new pieces of technology that are, for example, in which the community is perhaps divided about whether they are actually beneficial to a patient or not, in those instances where in various parts of the country people have differing opinions about the usefulness of these items and services, and where the medical community itself is divided about the benefits and the risks of technology, we usually step in. Now, policies can be made both on the local level. We have jurisdictions all across the country that make their own policy, or policies can be made on the national level. Because the local level policies, the process of making these decisions is similar, though definitely not the same, but is similar than that as compared to the national decisions. I'm just going to describe for you what happens on the national level. So what we do here in the central office is we write national coverage determinations, which defined by statute means that the secretary has decided with respect to whether or not a particular item or service is covered by our program. So these are basically the vehicles in which we publicly discuss our evaluations of technology, and in which we allow the public to comment on these evaluations to help us determine if an item or service is reasonable and necessary. So when we write a national coverage determination, we ask the question, is the evidence sufficient to conclude that the application of this particular technology will improve clinically meaningful health outcomes, again, for Medicare patients? We are looking at Medicare patients, be they those who are over 65 or those who are younger than 65. And we know that many services, many devices, how they work depends on who they are applied to, where they are applied to, the delivery setting, meaning inpatient, outpatient, physicians' offices, and how they are delivered. So what we do is we gather a body of evidence, and it's usually, hopefully, rather complete. We look for published articles, we look for societal evidence-based guidelines, we talk to experts, we commission technology assessments, which are basically a way to look for literature that perhaps we may have missed. We have Medicare evidence development and coverage advisory committee meetings where we ask experts to come in and spend a day looking at questions that revolve around the new devices, items, and services that we are considering for coverage. And very importantly, we ask for public comments. When we do a national coverage decision, there are two separate periods of time that we ask for public comments, and I must tell you, every single public comment is read. So we hope that we are very inclusive in all of our evidence before we make a decision. Now, again, this is not a short timeline. At the very least, it's 9 months. It can be longer than that if we have an advisory committee meeting. But when we do look at the evidence, we look at its strength, we look at its generalizability to Medicare, and then we look at sort of the overall weight of conclusions. If you look at 10 published articles on XYZ service, at least one of them is going to be different than the others. So we look at where the weight of the evidence lies. And very importantly, when we evaluate the literature, or we evaluate any other piece of evidence that we have in front of us, we look to see what kind of outcomes were provided by the investigators. We are looking for outcomes that are important to the patient, and we are very, very heavy on the functionality of the patient. Of course, we look at morbidity and we look at mortality, but we also look to see, does this thing or does this service help the patient to walk better, to perform their ADLs better? If it decreases, if it's to be used for pain and it decreases pain, we usually like to see a correlation that because the pain decreased, something else happened. Again, the patient functioned better, the patient was able to perhaps take less medications or get off of opioids or whatever the situation is. We very, very rarely look at money, whether something costs 5 cents or whether something costs $5 million. That is not our concern. What we want to see is how what this item or service does for the patient that is important to the patient. And so we also look at things like, if the patient uses this thing or whatever, do they spend less time in the hospital? Do they spend less time in ERs? Do they spend less time in skilled nursing facilities? This is what is important to us. Now, we know when we look at evidence that sometimes, particularly with new technology, there just may not be enough evidence there because people want to get to market and they may not have enough time to complete every sort of hoop that we want them to go through. So what we have done is we have created a couple of programs in which we hope we can get technology to market more quickly than we otherwise would, while also maintaining patient safeguards because we feel responsible for the safety of our beneficiaries. So the first program that I just want to sort of skim over is coverage with evidence development, with what we call CED, coverage with evidence development. There is a paradigm which, through the NCD process, we can do coverage within research. When we do a national coverage determination, we can either cover the thing, we can not cover the thing, we can cover the thing with conditions, or we can say, if you guys provide us with a research protocol that we approve, we will cover the thing within the parameters of that research project. Again, this is designed to balance how we would like to forward technology against safety of our beneficiaries. We may say we want a specific study design. We will give you our idea of where the evidence gaps are. We will tell you what general questions we want you to answer. And then you go ahead and you submit studies, which, we discussed. And eventually, there are many coverage with evidence development research projects that are forwarded and paid for by CMS. We have also clinical trial policies. I don't want to go into that, but we also have, we also pay for studies in the investigational device exemption world, the IDE world. I think Vivek might have touched on this, but there is, remember I said at the beginning of my presentation that for the most part, in order for something to be covered by CMS, it has to have already gone through and been approved or cleared for at least one indication for the FDA. There is one exception to this policy, and that is the investigative device exemption studies. The FDA has a way of providing classifications of various risk devices that have not been approved or cleared, and we have a means by which to look at them, evaluate the study, and if we deem it appropriate, then pay for that study for our beneficiaries. I want to, time is drawing short, I want to just get through the FDA and CMS parallel review program. The typical means by which someone gets their device to market is they go to the FDA first, they do a study that the FDA approves, and then they come to CMS. And many times CMS will say, well, we want a different kind of study, or we want a different kind of outcome measure. The FDA CMS parallel review program allows CMS, the FDA, and the person who is, or the entity who is submitting for approval, clearance, and coverage to all come together at the same table at the same time to discuss the study and determine if the study design is appropriate, if the outcome measures are appropriate, that sort of thing. Even if you don't go for the CMS parallel review program, you can, at the same time that you are talking to the FDA, you can always come to CMS and talk to us. We dialogue. It's a major part of our jobs to dialogue with investigators, manufacturers, suppliers, providers, et cetera, about their new items, services, and technology. So I encourage you all to, if you have something that you believe that CMS would be interested in, please contact us. How to do so is in the Innovator's Guide, or you can get a hold of me, and we will help you find the appropriate avenues by which to converse with us, so that you know what your steps are, you know where you have to be in order to be considered potentially coverable by CMS. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Miller. I'd like to invite Vivek back up and Megan Moynahan. And we're going to give this a go. Now we're going to complicate the live stream further by having it mixed with live. Again, I want to make it just a reminder to everybody remember what we're talking about here, especially after what we went through this morning, both within the science and the participant panel. These are really important, maybe challenging, but really important conversations, and that's the conversation we want to have now with Megan, who has, as you see in her bio, has some experience working at FDA, and then Vivek and Dr. Miller. So Megan, take it away, and then we'll open up for questions to participate.
And I just want to make sure, Susan, can you hear me when I'm on this microphone?
Yes, Megan, I can.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for having us and for setting up the session. As Matthew mentioned, I think the reason I was invited to moderate this session is because before I came to Cleveland and started working with the Institute for Functional Restoration, I was at the FDA for 17 years. I was a branch chief like Vivek was, over pacemakers. And one of the things I got involved in toward the end of my career there was ways that we could facilitate technology through the FDA. So we actually developed the Early Feasibility IDE program, which is like an easy on-ramp for technology that's trying to get into early clinical trials. And I helped set up what was called at the time the Innovation Pathway, which is now called Breakthrough Medical Devices program, and worked with people who are working on the patient preferences. So we were trying to do a lot of things to help facilitate that ecosystem. It's the post-lunch session and the regulatory session in combo, so we're going to try to get the energy really up here. But let me just recap something that Matthew was trying to convey. A lot of times we talk about these valleys of death as we're trying to move technology and new therapies through to commercial reality. One of them is just getting through the FDA process, having enough evidence to support what the FDA is expecting. That's the first valley of death. And then the other one really has to do with clinical uptake and whether people are actually deploying it clinically. And that has a lot to do with access. Do people have access to the technology? And so the gatekeeper there is CMS. And so in today's sessions, you're hearing from some of our gatekeepers, not the only gatekeepers, but some of our gatekeepers. So those two valleys of death. But we are coming off of probably one of the most exciting panels that we had just beforehand, which was the user panel. You can see these technologies have been developed. They have demonstrated proof of principle. People's lives are being changed. They're stuck in this sort of middle to end of the stage translational pathway. They're not necessarily getting all the way through the FDA yet, and they haven't gotten through CMS yet. So what are we going to do to try to get these technologies moving along? For the most part, we're going to make sure that our audience members get a chance to ask our speakers some questions, but let me start by posing a couple maybe softball questions to you guys. So Vivek, one of the things that you were talking about was the patient preferences program, which is designed to take a collective voice of a community and bring it in the form of evidence to the FDA. But have you seen anything like that coming into your branch to date? Have you seen any studies that have come through yet, or any applications that have been trying to incorporate the voice of patients into your application review?
Right, that's a great question. One thing I forgot to say at the end of my presentation, there are certain things I can't talk about because of confidentiality reasons. But talking along those lines, and I hope we're not necessarily known as the Valley of Death, but maybe the Valley of Life. But I think it's important for the groups to get to know one another and share information, because while we're able to give information to individuals and individual organizations, there's nothing, at least for us, to prevent groups from talking to one another, and also maybe creating surveys together, submitting them maybe through the advocacy organizations, and getting our feedback that way. But it is a very active program across the center. I have had experience with it, but which is also why I definitely encourage folks to submit their ideas, so then we can at least help out in saying, okay, it's not really these areas. These are great areas, and maybe these are the areas to keep in the survey, especially when considering, the statutory requirements for CMS. But for us, focus on these areas that link specifically to, the clinical benefits and those quantifiable clinical benefits. But that is something that I guess you guys would have to facilitate, sharing amongst each other.
I'll maybe pitch the same question over to Susan, because I feel like one of the things I know FDA is really committed to is trying to incorporate the voice of patient communities in this way. It used to be in the olden days that if a patient community was upset with the decision that the FDA was making, they would go and march and protest. But the problem with that approach is it's too late in the game. They're hearing your voice when they've already made a decision. And what the FDA is actively trying to do is collect those perceptions and those expectations before they make a decision. And so, Susan, maybe over to you. Does CMS have anything comparable where you're actively seeking evidence in the form of either survey results or risk-benefit preference models that bring in the voice of the patient to CMS for its decision-making?
Well, when we make our national coverage determinations, like I said, there are 2 periods of time in which we solicit public comments, be they patients, investigators, whoever. We pay attention to the opinions of all of these groups. In one of the last NCDs that I worked on before I worked on my current NCD, I missed an article that was brought to us by, some organizations. We meet with associations, we meet with societies. I get phone calls from individuals all the time expressing their opinions. So I think that CMS does solicit public comments. We encourage people to come to us or to write into us. For example, the Coverage and Analysis Group has a hotline, or I forget what we call it, a CAG inquiry line. And then, like I said, on many of these NCDs, we get hundreds of comments, and on some of the other policies throughout the agency, there are thousands of comments. So we do, and every single one of them is read and considered. If you read the Federal Register, if you're an insomniac, you can actually see where all of the commenters, or what the commenters have said and what the reply was from CMS. We don't always agree, but many times things are changed because of the public comments.
So, Susan, staying with you for a moment, one of the things you talked about was the parallel review program, which is a way that a company can interface and have conversations with the FDA and CMS at the same time. So instead of going through these 2 hurdles sequentially, they can actually, kind of compress that a little bit. So one of my questions is are you finding industry taking you up, as it were, with this with the possibility of this program, where you're seeing a lot of applications through parallel review, or do people still find it challenging, and what do you think the challenges might be?
Well, in the beginning, I think we had very few parallel review requests, but now I know we have many in the hopper. So I think it's just a matter of the word getting out there, and then going through the various steps that take you into the parallel review program. We've had many companies, manufacturers, investigators, whoever it is, approach us in recent months.
Great. So, and I know that also in the audience, we have people who are investigators, people who are researchers, trying to design clinical trials. Anyone who is out there like designing a clinical trial, are you thinking about what the CMS requirements might be at the same time you're trying to think about FDA, or are you still just, are people mostly just contemplating getting their foot in the door with the FDA? I think that that's something to think about. There's ways that we can get out in front of some of these requirements, instead of doing things in two steps, maybe do them all together. But it means working interactively with both agencies at the same time. Is that something, Vivek, that you've actually had coming through your branch at all? Anything similar to that?
This one, yeah. We have, it's probably not going to be the extent with Susan where she sees, much wider, amount of device areas, but we have, we've shared, our feedback with the sponsors. Now, the thing is, each of us share our feedback separately, so, we don't see what CMS says and they don't see what we say. And so, we're not really sure, I guess, on both sides, what are things that can change to it's really up to the sponsor to pick up the feedback to know what things to incorporate, so that their studies can address, both parties. But, certainly encourage folks to share with both agencies the thoughts, also so it kind of sparks in our brains, the reviewers' brains, of ways that we can help. Mm-hmm. But we do see them time to time, and I think they've generally been helpful, but it's a long process, so I'm not necessarily sure if we can get that kind of data either yet, until further along.
Right. I mean, I think one of the things, so
Megan, can I just say one thing?
Yeah, please.
Again, people don't have to go through the formal parallel review program if they've missed it, or they don't want to submit for it or whatever. Again, we have informal conversations with many groups all the time, and we encourage that in our policy-making process. People can come into CMS if they want to. If they don't want to travel, we do it by phone. And we would discuss with them basically the same information that we would discuss with them through the parallel review program. So they can either do it inside the program or they can come informally to CMS.
That's great. I want to make sure the audience knows if you have questions, just raise your hand. Oh, we got one. Okay. Surprise, Jen.
Is this on? Okay.
Yeah.
There it is. So actually, question for both of you. Actually, two questions. But so Vivek, I know the FDA just recently launched their Patient and Care Partner Program. Could you talk a little bit about that? And before you answer that, I would direct people to the Huvo app. In documents, there's something called SCI Community Survey for FDA that closes on October 7th. That's FDA taking an effort to listen to our voice, specifically for spinal cord injuries, so please complete that survey before October 7th.
And if
so,
you don't have the Huva app, download it so you can look at it.
Yeah.
For free. So Vivek, if you could go into that program a little bit, and then the second question is both for you and for Susan, is, you've made an effort in terms of listening to the patient voice or understanding our preferences. How does that play into the parallel review process? And how does that play in if the review processes are separated?
So for the first one, I said, Susan, I'll start. I actually am not familiar with the Patient and Care Partnership Program. There's a lot of programs that are, in different offices in the in CDRH, and so in ours we're mainly focused on the pre-market and post-market review of the submissions, but I can look into that and see who's in charge of that program to talk with them about it, and maybe I can send some information afterwards.
That would be great, because there is information on the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium
Okay.
website that goes to link directly to it, as we are one of the 14 organizations that are partners in that program.
Okay. And preferences. So with pre-market review, we need to make decisions based on benefit and risk, and it's dependent on the patient population and what stage that maybe subpopulations are in in their disease or disorder. So whether it's separate or in parallel, we need to know that voice of the patient. If they're, even if it's not necessarily for the marketing submission, but even for the investigational study, what risks are they willing to accept for that potential benefit, and not just risks, but what known things that they're going to undergo to accept that benefit. So it's I guess I wouldn't say that I would look at it necessarily like between the parallel review and separate. I think we would, even through the parallel review, we were going to give the same comments even separately.
Can I ask you a couple clarifying questions? One relative to what, related to what Jen asked, and maybe you can't answer this, particularly from the FDA. Can you give an example of what you just described so that it's a little less abstract?
Yeah.
Is there an example of what investigational study, or where does the community need to speak to, even relative to the things that we just experienced this morning? And my second part of that clarifying question, also related, and but this will also betray my ignorance. Can either of you describe the optimal team of representative stakeholders where this process is most effective, so that, because I mean, I don't think I'm cynical, but I am skeptical of how things, you may have an open process to take responses from the community, but if it's not attached to anything very specific and it doesn't maybe have some of the right players attached to it, it's really not of much value to us ultimately. So if you could comment or answer.
Matthew, I'll actually answer your first question because, as Vivek mentioned, he's not allowed to talk about trade secret and proprietary stuff, but we can talk about our application. So we have the multifunction technology that Kim Anderson was demonstrating this morning, which provides her with hand function and trunk stability. One of the things we wanted to do was get out in front of what we think the FDA is going to be asking us about the benefit and risk. So we did a survey of over 400 people with spinal cord injury and asked them about their willingness to trade off the specific risks and the specific benefits of that technology. Vivek hasn't seen the data yet because it's going to be coming to him a little bit later, but what it's helping us do is help us understand that the benefits are considered to be very favorable to people with cervical level injury, and that there's quite a bit of willingness to take on the known risks that we anticipate for implanted technology. So we feel fairly confident that the experience and the expectations of the community living with spinal cord injury would accept the benefit risk profile. And so when we present our data ultimately to the FDA, we'll be presenting their data alongside it, and then it'll help hopefully Vivek's team evaluate that.
Yeah, thanks.
Come in.
Yeah, and I guess the second question was the optimal team, and I mean definitely from a review side, I can see what the optimal team is for reviewing submissions, but I don't know if you want to speak about that, or
I
Hunter,
will
maybe.
too, because I remember this as a branch chief, because I used to train my employees, and I'd say you feel like you are working on behalf of patients, and you see patients as your customer, or you see doctors as your customer, but at the end of the day, 99 times out of 100 when the phone rings, it's not the patient at the other end, and it's not a doctor, it's industry. And so ultimately at the end of the day, Vivek and his team are talking continuously with companies, really, for the most part. And so it's the companies who have to be bringing the voice of the patient in, or to be establishing the connection to CMS if they're going to do parallel review. It's really beholden on the person, the entity bringing the application to the FDA and to CMS to set up that team.
Hi, I have a question to both the FDA and the CMS. So drug approval is always covered by CDER or CBER, depending whether it's a small molecule or biologics. But if you develop and approve a drug, either under CDER or CBER rules, in combination with perhaps a device and or rehabilitation, how does the device division of the FDA and the CMS address potentially changing coverage or changing the label on the device when the drug is approved in combination with device A or rehabilitation?
I guess I'll start off. So that's so first off, when you do have like a combination product, then if it's kind of clear whichever center is going to lead it, they start leading it and they consult with other centers. But if it's something novel and there needs to be like a jurisdiction that's determined, then we have this Office of Combination Products or OCP that does this jurisdictional determination.
So let's say the drug is brand new, right? But the device is, say, approved already. Then how do the device division handle it?
Right. So
does it leave it to the drug division?
Right. There might be different criteria, of course, for determining the jurisdiction. If it's a novel drug, I would think that CDER would be primarily reviewing it, and then they would consult, the review staff in the device division to help. There's also a lot of cross-cutting things that other centers already have expertise on too. They'll have biocompatibility experts just like we will. Parallel clinicians, and so most of the time, what we provide, if we're consulting with let's say CDER, is that engineering factor, and especially in my division. I don't know enough about the coverage issues though, so I don't know if Susan, do you want to tackle that one?
Well, we have the ability to cover with conditions. So if there is, in particular, let's say a new drug out there, but it works best or only with a certain device, we would have the ability to write a policy that goes along those lines.
So to follow up on that, so if you have a drug that's approved and in the label it says it's used in combination with rehabilitation, would CMS consider expanding existing coverage of rehabilitation in the context of the use of the drug? Or it's not necessary at all?
That's a loaded question, okay? And it depends as to whether or not all the other regulatory rules of Medicare have been fulfilled. Who's providing the service, how it's being provided, where it's being provided. If it's an outpatient, rehab sort of technique, are there or are there not any caps that have to be, considered? All of those pieces of the pie need to be considered. And that's why we encourage people to come in early and talk to us so that we can pull the right people together and give them, our best estimate of where they need to go.
Great. Thank you very much.
I think.
So Susan Miller, this question is directed to you. So, FDA kind of makes it rather clear they're looking at risk versus benefit. When you're looking at CMS for coverage, give us an idea from the patient perspective of what type of data points are you looking for feedback for us when it comes to for coverage and for your national coverage decisions?
Well, we're looking at patient health outcomes like we were talking about before. So function is, for me at least, in my area, number one. Ambulation, ADLs, pain coordinated with function, that sort of thing. Does it keep people out of the hospital? Does it prevent them from getting surgeries? Do they need grafts over wounds? Do they need amputations? Those are the sorts of outcomes that we are looking for. It depends on what the item or service is. So, for example, a couple of months ago, we put out a decision on vagus nerve stimulators for depression. Obviously, we would use various kinds of depression scales. We would look at response of depression. We would look at remission of depression. We would look at durability. Durability, we are big on durability. We would, if something happens once, that's nice. We would like it to be a durable outcome for our patients. If they're going to go, for example, through the risk of having an implanted device, for example, we would like whatever benefit that implanted device gives them to be reasonably durable. Does that help?
That does help. I'm also wondering, in terms of, we hear a lot about cost effectiveness when it comes to CMS, as well as comparative effectiveness. Can you touch on both of those?
Well, we do not have authority to do cost effectiveness. So I think, and don't quote me on this, but I think the only time that we can take money into account is on preventative services, which, as have to be legislated anyway, or have to be recommended by the USPSTF. Otherwise, like I said, if it costs a nickel or if it costs $5 billion, that does not go into our policy decisions. It would only be the outcome measures, like at this point in time, it is only the outcome measures like I just described. Or that would be otherwise pertinent to, whichever device you were looking at.
I have one. I hate to dominate the microphone, but I have one more question.
Does anybody else have a question? Okay, one last question.
Okay, one last question.
Wait, there was someone back there.
We deal with a lot when we look at startup ventures or new devices that are coming on the market. One of the mistakes we typically hear from those companies is that they already have a CPT code, so we're not worried about reimbursement. Susan, can you give us some advice when it comes to early devices in that regard?
Everybody needs to be clear that Medicare is run by law, and most categories of items, services, devices have their pricing performed by some formula that is in the law. We cannot change that. In order to change that, you have to go to Congress. So that is just something that you need to keep in mind as you develop new technology.
Okay, one last.
You mentioned that you look at positive patient medical outcomes when considering coverage. And I'm sorry. And I wondered if we saw a device earlier where it decreased caregiver assistance for somebody, and I wondered if caregiver outcomes are also considered.
We don't treat the caregiver, However, let's just say that somebody needed, I'm making this up, max assist of 1 before, and now they can walk independently with, some sort of device. That is a patient outcome that is positive. Okay, so you just have to see how it's flipped. We can't treat the caregiver, but if it decreases caregiver hands-on time, then it increases patient's independence. That's a positive health outcome.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Vivek. Thank you, Dr. Miller.
My pleasure.
Got me on? Okay. I know this, I just want to make a quick comment. This is difficult stuff, dry. It's hard to follow some of it. It's not very sexy. But if nothing else, for those of you who are having a hard time keeping track and staying interested, I just want to say one thing to you, and it kind of, I think, gets back to a comment that Corinne made earlier about why can't this happen faster. I think, I'll sort of personalize over the years that I've been doing this advocacy work since my son was injured. I think we in the advocacy community, we spend a lot of time on the push side. We want to fund research. We want to get to an intervention that's going to work. We're pushing. And a lot of times we forget that there's a pull side. And that's the side of industry, companies, marketplaces, regulation, CMS payment, insurance coverage. All those things really, really matter. And they're difficult. They're difficult to understand. They're difficult to interact and engage with. I think that's maybe somewhat clear. But it's really, really important for us, if nothing else, to just be conscious of that and aware of that and begin to start to strategize and think about, okay, well, how do we, when we do find something that's worth, that's picking up some speed on that push side, on that translation wheel, it's starting to spin the wheel, how do we get to the place where we can make sure it turns into something, right? So that's really why we wanted to have this part of the conversation, and just, if nothing else, just to really be thinking about that. Maybe it's a little bit of a, take one scale off the eye so you can look at things a little differently. That make sense? Okay. All right, so please welcome Barry Munro. He is one of our board members at United Paralysis. He's going to talk to you a little bit about U2FP, and then we're going to take a break. Okay?
Well, thanks, Matt. You mentioned the dry and the sexy. I ain't sexy, so we might be still in the dry area, but thank you very much for being here this weekend. On behalf of the Unite to Fight Paralysis Board of Directors, I wanted to thank you personally and the board itself. The board members are scattered throughout this weekend. You'll see us, we have the red tags underneath. At any time you got a complaint, you got a praise, you got a comment, please tackle one of us and have the conversation. I'm recently just joined the board a few years ago, and I've been involved in this space for over 32 years since my accident in 1987. And I've seen a recent evolution, which is somewhat exciting and also problematic. It's very interesting in that my adult life grew up in the spinal cord injury world in a very balkanized universe. There are great people all over the globe working hard to find a resolution, hard to advocate in their community for more care, and also fighting hard in their community to fund research for a cure. And in fact, what we saw over the years was almost two different camps. You know it, the cure camp, the care camp. Something's happened. I'm seeing now where there's a unification, where there isn't those camps so much anymore. And I've got to see that over the last few years. In fact, my recent attendance at Working to Walk conferences, And I've seen a unification of those camps. I've seen the unbalkanization. I've seen almost a globalization in both internally within the regions of the good old US of A, but also internationally. We have people from Europe here. We have people from Canada, and we have people right here in the US. But what more importantly, we have people from different organizations representing sometimes different constituencies, but more importantly, the same ones. We are suffering out there, and that is the whole point of Unite to Fight Paralysis. And what we have done as an organization, we have united. And these conferences that you see every year, in my opinion, get better. Thank you, Matthew and staff. You guys are really doing something here. But it's not just this weekend. It is the working groups that have been formed that are looking at the neuromodulation sector, working groups working with activity-based training. Let's take a look at that. We are tackling things and trying to unify a very confused space. And we're having conversations with FDA and CMS. And more importantly, we are also responding to the growing need and the voice from both our community and the pull from industry to invite us a seat at the table of people with injuries. We in this room represent so many things. I see therapists, I see industry, I see regulators, I see organizations representing hundreds of thousands of people, I see leaders, and most importantly, I see community. I see the family members and those people who are suffering from spinal cord injury. The problem is, what about the people that aren't in this room? What about the people that can't afford to be here because of their situation? And we know what that is with a spinal cord injury. What about those people who are compromised because of their health that can't be here? What about those people that just aren't here anymore? Our fallen soldiers. What about them? We are all we. And we have a responsibility as the leaders in this room to do something about it. Now, we've seen some great change. It's been absolutely fantastic. But we are not done. And I'm sorry I'm going to say it again, but people are dying. We need to stress the urgency. We need to unite. And what Unite to Fight Paralysis has done as an organization has brought that together on a shoestring budget. We need more help. We at Unite to Fight Paralysis need more help. We need financial assistance. If you have the opportunity, and I'm going to do that, I'm going to ask, if you have the means, please make a donation to Unite to Fight Paralysis. I'm not going to be afraid to ask because we know you need somebody to turn the lights on, and there's a basket out there, and there's a desk for Unite to Fight Paralysis. But more importantly, too, we need you. We need your input. We need you to participate in some way, and we need you to spread the word. We have a desk over there at the break and throughout this weekend. If you want to be more involved with Unite to Fight Paralysis and what happens here in this weekend, but what happens the 364 other days of the year in the organization, please become involved. The Cure Advocacy Networks and the great success in the great states that have happened so far has been the result of the advocacy work of Unite to Fight Paralysis and our partners and all of you and most of you in the room. We need you. We can get this thing done, and we can't let it happen at the rate it's going. We need to make it happen faster because people are dying. We don't need to suffer anymore if we can turn up the heat and we can advocate more. But we can do that. We've come so far. 30 years ago, it was a desert, and we didn't even talk to each other. We were all in different worlds and all in different corners. But the fact that we are all together right now and the way we're communicating right now, it is absolutely amazing. These are exciting times, but let us not lose this opportunity. Let's increase the momentum. Let's speed up the momentum. And let's get this thing done so we don't have to get together every year like this. But it's exciting. And I really want to thank you for what you've done and what you've done here today. And don't stop. Don't stop the conversations in the hallways. Don't stop, especially the conversations around the bar, because that's always fun. But keep it going. And we will do something exciting. And these are where things come out of. These are where we germinate the great seeds of ideas and the ideas that come out of here. But let's not let it stop on Saturday at 5 o'clock. Let's go beyond this. So if there's any way you think you can participate, and again, it might not be writing a check. It's really about what you can do. But more importantly, please tell, whoa, I'm getting excited here. Please tell others about this weekend, because next year, we're going to Utah. So on behalf of the board, I'd like to announce that Salt Lake City is going to be the home of Working to Walk next year. We're going to be at the Sheraton, and our what are you doing here? Title sponsor is going to be the University of Utah Craig Nielsen Memorial Rehab Hospital as a title sponsor. And we'd like to thank the Nielsen Foundation for that and all the folks out in Utah. But let's take the momentum out of this year's event and carry it through next year. You guys are absolutely fantastic, and thank you for giving your time this weekend, because it means a lot to all of us. We feed off of each other. We challenge each other. We're all brothers and sisters in this thing, and I think we all agree that there needs to be more done, and we think we can do it if we unify together. So again, thank you, and enjoy the rest of the weekend. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. We are going to take a break. I wanted to mention just a couple of things that Barry said, just so it's clear to those of you who don't know. A couple of things. When Barry mentioned the Cure Advocacy Network, for those of you who don't know, we have in the last few years passed legislation to fund spinal cord injury research in a number of states: Washington, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, Ohio, most recently here a few months ago. And you'll hear more about that tomorrow, for those of you who are staying through tomorrow. And the other is, Barry mentioned 2 work groups, the activity-based exercise and training, and then neuromodulation. We have facilitated work groups amongst all the scientists working in not all, but many of the scientists working in neuromodulation. We've had quarterly conference calls, and the whole idea was that the scientists were telling us they're not talking together enough. They're kind of siloized in their work. And so we said, well, let's facilitate you talking more. So we've been doing that. We've had 7 conference calls over the last year and 3 quarters. And I think we sort of crossed over a place to make strides where people are beginning to share information. People are beginning to strategize about what are we measuring? How are we measuring? How are we classifying people? What's the strategy for moving these things forward? I think it's been a really successful work group of many of those scientists that you all have heard about and know about working in this space. The other is activity-based therapy and exercise group. Many of those people are here today. We are going to meet tomorrow. There's been a recently formed association of centers, independent centers across the country. We've been talking about this together for almost 2 years. Cynthia, Tricia, right? 2 years? Yeah, so it's kind of been a core group of those centers. We've said, hey, look, this is an area where I think we can work together to strengthen these centers, that many of which struggle financially, many of which come from within our community, but they're providing a really critical resource for our community. So how can we strengthen that? How can we build capacity amongst them? So this association has recently formed. We're looking, and we'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow with Hal and Mike's presentation from Perfect Step in Southern California. And in some ways, as Dale over here is part of the, I think is probably one of the most significant reasons why we're going to Salt Lake City next year. Dale, if you don't know him, might want to introduce yourself to him as a very successful center called NeuroWorks outside of Salt Lake City. It's a great place. Seen it myself, and they do great work for our community there. Many of those folks who are here, we're going to meet tomorrow at the end of the conference to talk about that part of our strategy. And so I just want to kind of touch on those things so it's really clear. These are the kinds of things that we can do together. Back to my earlier comments about relationship. That's the relationship that we want to build amongst everybody. And the idea of Barry said to take it home with you. That relationship, that idea of take it back to your community, to where you are. So thanks for listening. Let's take a break, and then we'll come back for a couple more presentations.